So welcome to our study. Just a sec, I'm just gonna do something with the light. Okay. So today we'll be looking further at the teachings on dependent arising, Praticca Samutpada. So we'll begin with invoking Omniscient Jigme Lingpa, the source of love and compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind treasures, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity. Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. So presently within the text, we're studying the Four Noble Truths, which are very important for us to understand that suffering does not just come about on the basis of either random occurrence, nor are we destined to suffer, nor are we being tested by some cosmic power, but it's simply on the basis of causes and conditions, just like when we have a particular physical imbalance, illness, and so on. We can diagnose, where does this come from? How does this originate? So the point really with the Four Noble Truths is for us to understand that and acknowledge there is suffering, and we've looked at the various forms of suffering, and we also looked at the causes, but now we're looking at, particularly with regards to the path and the cessation of suffering, we're looking at the nature in which you could say all phenomena, all our experience originates. Now, in general, when we talk about the cause and effect, or rather when we talk about dependent arising, and we understand how our reality exists in terms of cause and effect, we're talking about relative truth. So everything that really has to do with us understanding samsara, nirvana, the path, rebirth, enlightenment, this all belongs to relative truth. And of course, what we very often have in the classical teachings are representations of relative truth. And that's very much comes from a place in which the Buddha wished for us to begin to understand where we actually are presently. But of course, very often what happens is that the understanding of relative truth in the context of Buddhist cultures, societies, is very different from the way that we understand relative truth in the modern world. And so when we in the modern world encounter all the various teachings that have to do with rebirth and so forth, we sometimes think, oh, well, that's probably some sort of cultural thing. And that's not at all the case. It's very much based on an understanding, however, of the primacy of mind and the way in which the mind generates what we in effect could call the phenomenologies of samsara and nirvana. These are all experiences that we have. They're not locations, they're not places, but they are realities that we experience, and on the basis of mind. And so that's a very important point for us to understand, and that is where the teaching on dependent arising essentially describes how, on the basis of just delusion or ignorance, we generate the experience that we have in terms of our life, our realm, or our, you could say, environment, our world, and us as individuals. So it's very close to home. It's not about something abstract and other, you could say, it's not about another culture's view on reality. It's based on the science that analyzes where does this situation come from. We very often have this example we have in the classical presentation of the Pratyeka Buddha. There's somebody who goes to a cemetery, looks at a bone and say, where does this come from? And analyzes all the way back through the fact that this person died, somebody who died must have been born, what brought about birth, what is the nature of the causes for birth, and so forth. And going all the way back to the understanding of ignorance. So that is where we say, in principle, somebody could gain complete insight on their own. That's the nature of the Pratyeka Buddha, somebody who does it on their own. And so we also would say sometimes in eons where there's no Buddha, then there would be persons who essentially would deduce how we come into existence on the basis of ignorance. So this understanding is really something that runs as a red thread through all of Buddhism, and also in terms of us as practitioners of meditation. This is also what enables us to look at reality, look at our experience and say, well, it all appears, and yet because it's continually a set of causes and conditions, it has no enduring absolute reality. It has no, what we say is it doesn't have inherent existence. And that's rather important for us to establish in terms of the reality that we're weaning ourselves off. You could say the habitual patterns that we become addicted to, and which we sort of by default fall back on in terms of our understanding of reality. There's a solid reality out there. There's a solid self. And that's where the teaching on dependent arising is said to be incredibly profound. Another aspect, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, is the understanding of how dependent arising plays out in terms of our lifetimes. So that's where there's quite a science around that, and I have to humbly admit, it's not exactly a science that I'm terribly familiar with, but we're going to be going through the text, and there will be sections which I will just be reading, and I'll read it slowly, but I am pretty much, you could say, it's unfamiliar territory for me. Maybe together we'll generate some understanding as we're reading this. Anyway, I'm just going to hear then the root text, just a sec. The root text says, this teaching, so profound, dependence of effects on causes, is the very treasure of the truth the conqueror has taught. Yet true and supreme peace transcends the deeds that bring forth high or low existence, white and black phenomena in causal sequence. And when the unborn nature of phenomena is realized, it will manifest. So that's where we understand how, on a relative level, in terms of our experience, suffering originates on the basis of particular causes. Happiness originates on the basis of particular causes. And I think most of us are familiar with the wheel of existence in which this is described. But of course, what we're talking about here is on the very, you could say, outer ring of the this. And you're probably all familiar with this chart. I've also shown it a few times. But what we call the wheel of existence, sometimes rather sort of misleadingly referred to as the wheel of life. I'm not sure if we really can justify calling that life, but so be it. Let me just see here. But here you have then, here for example, we can see these are the black deeds that create the lower realms, the positive deeds, the white deeds that create the higher realm. And all along then, this takes place on the basis of these 12 links. And we looked at this last time. So let's just see where we got to. Okay. So 4 ways of presenting the principle of dependent arising. All right. So we're going to be looking at that. So first of all, here they are. Ignorance, formation, or what is it again they're called here? Conditioning factors, consciousness, name and form, nama rupa, the 6 senses, contact, feeling, sensations, desire, clinging, becoming, birth, old age, and death. Now these are then, you could say, events that one after the other bring forth particular experience. I mean, ignorance, that's also where last time we looked at how we understand ignorance. And that's where Trungpa Rinpoche, he gave this brilliant example really of us essentially dancing freely without any self-consciousness, one with the entire experience, not having a second thought, not watching ourselves, simply just one and at ease, enjoying space. And then all of a sudden there's a notion, I am dancing. And all of a sudden there's the, you could say, the clunky quality of us and space. And that's where we have the first skandha, which is then the skandha of form, where we begin to think I and the experience of other. And that is where in Buddhism we say this is where samsara originates. And that's where what we were brought up in our culture, we would say, well, yeah, self and other, well, that's a given. But in the Buddhist, not just belief, but in the Buddhist view, the Buddhist perspective, the Buddhist insight, that's where there is the recognition that this is ignorance, this is delusion, but it drives all of suffering. And as such, suffering is not a given. Suffering is just something that comes about on the basis of this fundamental ignorance. But ignorance then drives these mental formations. We want to do something. And then we have consciousness. Then we have the various experiences of the skandhas and so on. There's different ways of describing this. Of course, in the various traditions, they describe this in various forms, but this is generally something that's basic to Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, the 12 links. And it's kind of along across all the lines of Buddhism. But we do sometimes have, for example, in the Great Perfection, we have other ways of understanding and describing the origins of, particularly actually in the Great Perfection, there's a lot of very precise knowledge around this first moment of ignorance and how it takes place and how we can see through it. Anyway, so we have these 4 ways of presenting the principle of dependent arising, and that's where also I've made a few charts that possibly should make it slightly easier. Let's see here, let me just find it. I don't know if it's making it easier, made it easier, slightly easier for myself as I was reading this. So we can understand these 12 links in terms of the first 2 have to do with what comes from our past lives. This is what's happening in our future lives, and this is then what will drive future lives. So that's where then it says here, then Kangyur Rinpoche comments, presented as a cycle of 12 links, the principle of dependent arising throws light on our past, present, and future. The links of ignorance and conditioning factors are related with previous existences, while those of birth and aging and death refer to subsequent existences. The 8 intervening links relate to the present existence. So we could comfortably see how ignorance is something that has taken place before, and the conditioning factors that drive who we are have then brought us into this life. And here we are then essentially equipped with all these aspects of our being, consciousness, and up to becoming, in the sense that we're always moving towards something on the basis of the previous conditions. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, thus this doctrine reveals the interdependence of past, present, and future lives. So then we also have some ways in which we understand the 12 links as the 3 paths of defilement, karma, and suffering. So essentially kleshas, karma, and what is the result of these, which is suffering. So Kangyur Rinpoche says the 12 links are also presented in terms of the 3 paths: defilement, karma, and suffering. The first, the 8th and the 9th link. So this one here, ignorance, craving, and grasping. These constitute kleshas. We say ignorance is a klesha because it's the fundamental place in which then the notion of self, which is the basis for all the toxic attitudes that we have, originates. So that's where we say, for example, the 3 root kleshas are ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So that's a klesha. And then also craving, we want something, and we grasp, we hold on to. So these all come from this condition of the kleshas or the defilements, emotions or conflicting emotions. So that's related to defilements. The second and 10th links, the conditioning factors in becoming, are related to karma. So these two here, again, conditioning factors are what drives us, all the different attitudes that we have in terms of, and not just attitudes, but more actually experiences. Conditioning factors, samskaras, they're all the psychological experiences what we have. They're of course all tinged with defilement, but we essentially see these in terms of particular states of mind that are created by previous conditions. So that brings about then impulses to do something. So we call this conditioning factors or mental factors, but also sometimes we would say impulse. And that again takes us to becoming. Again, we're heading somewhere. So that's karma. The remaining links, in other words, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 11th, and 12th, all of these here, consciousness, name and form, 6 senses or sense powers, contact, feeling, birth, old age, and death, all of these are related to suffering. This is where we would say these constitute the various forms in which we are experiencing the condition of a sentient being, that we're held within this condition, limited condition of discomfort, stress, and so forth. Thus, 3 links form the path of defilements, meaning over here. 2 links form the path of karma, and 7 links account for the path of suffering. Again, the 12 links of dependent arising are presented with regards to the karmic principle of cause and effect. That is, of actions leading to birth. So that again has to do with what brought us here. Okay, let's just see if there's some questions, if I can answer them. As ignorance is fundamental from the being of our life, is it possible to mistake ignorance as wisdom? Yeah, that is possible. I think we're doing that all the time, in that we actually, as sentient beings, we're stumbling in the dark. So that's why we're relying on what is essentially ignorance. But relying on it is then where we are as ignorance. As ignorant individuals, we just don't know better. So that's where we mistake, where we're guided by ignorance. Yeah. In terms of, if we're strictly speaking in terms of the practice of meditation, we sometimes would warn about how settling the mind without fabricating could possibly be a condition of settling into the all ground. And that's where it's very important, particularly in the context of the practice of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, that there's clarification with regards to what is the all ground, the alaya vijnana, the basis for samsara, which is, you could say, the ultimate space of ignorance, and wisdom. Simply because the all ground in itself is completely neutral. That's why somebody could just settle into a state of neutrality and think that is wisdom. So there's some discussions around subtle aspects of meditation in that regard. Brilliant. Thank you so much for the charts. They're perfect. Okay, that's good. I'm glad it's helpful. Very much like I started off saying, also for my own sake. So, so yes. So these are about how various factors lead to birth. On the causal side, and that's the green ones, okay? There are 2 links associated with karma, the 2nd and the 10th. So that's karma here. And also we have what we call the causal moment of consciousness. Yeah. So conditioning factors and becoming, and 3 links associated with the emotions. Okay, sorry, or afflictions, defilements, right? Yeah. So that's then, I don't know, Padmakara being a little bit, I think, inconsistent here, because on one hand they say defilements, didn't they? Did they say defilements? Yeah. And now they're There's equal. There would be kleshas, both of them, but one place they're saying, I think, defilements, and the other they're saying emotions. Mind you, I'll be very careful about calling Padmakara out on making mistakes, but that's just how it appears to me. So anyway, I'm saying kleshas here, but anyway, 3 emotions: the first, the 8th, and the 9th. Yeah. So these are causes for rebirth. And then it says, to these 5 links may be added the cause moment aspect of consciousness. So there's 6 links associated with making up 6 links that are cause related. On the result side are the 6 links associated with suffering: name and form, which we have here, the sense powers, contact, feeling, and then birth, old age, and death. To these may added the result moment up here of consciousness, thus bringing the total to 7 links that are result related. I think you might begin to understand why this topic can be a little bit difficult to just sort of be at home with. But I also have to say, this is not something I've studied a lot. And like I was just saying to a friend, for me, dependent arising, it's generally just been so wonderful. It sort of enables you to have an idea of where you could say samsara originates from, and it also enables you to understand in that everything is dependently arisen. It is ultimately the nature of emptiness. When we have the Madhyamika reasonings, we sometimes have what we call the 4 or 5 Madhyamika reasonings that establish emptiness. Then we would say the king of reasoning is the dependent arising, simply understanding that anything that is conditioned, dependently arisen, cannot be unconditional, cannot be independent, and that basically refutes the idea of inherent existence. Anyway, as far as just understanding you could say the many ramifications of the links of dependent arising and the future, past, future lives, and so on, then this is of course a discussion that has to be had. So Kangyur Rinpoche says it is possible to consider consciousness as a single link, in which case it is placed with the causes, with the result that the 2 groups of cause-related and result-related links each contain 6 items. So that's where then this simply just becomes cause. So we have 6 causes and 6 results. Of course, since each link makes possible the one following it, each link possesses both causal and resultant aspects. Okay, so this is not that difficult to understand, because of course we understand how link 1 leads inevitably link 2, and that's how we can understand the progression that takes us all the way to old age and death. So in that sense, yes, that we understand sort of how the principle works universally. But he says, in the present instance, they are grouped as cause and effect with regards to the production of lives. Finally, the 12 interdependent links may be thought of in terms of 2 groups, propeller and propelled, accomplisher and accomplished. So this is what we have then here. So motivated by ignorance, then we have here, motivated by ignorance, we have then concomitant with ego clinging, conditioning factors give rise to karma that creates the impulse for a subsequent life. These 2 links, therefore, are propellers, to which is added the cause moment consciousness. By contrast, the result moment consciousness and the following 4 links of name and form, sense powers, contacts, and feeling constitute the propelled. So that's where if we include this one here, the 3rd one, as a propeller, then the following 4 then are the propelled. They are what is engendered by action. In addition, the 3 links of craving, grasping, and becoming are said to be accomplishers of the subsequent life. These here then, so the accomplishers of a subsequent life, while the 2 links of birth and aging and death are the accomplished. Thus, there are 2 propelling links 5 propelled links, 3 accomplished links, and 2 accomplished links. Okay, I shall comment no further on this. Where are these groupings from? I think they are from the Abhidharma, possibly the Abhidharma Kosha, but I'm not sure. And it is something that we do find it in the various teachings. So yeah. So then there's this thing about the lifetimes required. So someone asks, please, would you say more about what accomplisher relates to or means? Well, that is where I have to fall back on my initial disclaimer at the beginning of this class. This is something that I'm not terribly familiar with. And what I also said is I'm just going to have to simply read through this with you. So I'm afraid I can't answer that. And there's going to be a lot here that I'm reading that actually I won't be able to explain. So this is where you can see there's a huge difference between a Kempo, somebody classically trained who would have, you know, have a firm grip on this, and someone like myself who, you could say, out of devotion to the subject matter, is, you could say, very enthusiastic with regards to the material, but at the same time, not in this case. Certainly, I do not have a you know, adequate knowledge of this. So we will just read this together. So the number of lifetimes required for an entire cycle. At the longest, a cycle of 12 links set in motion by one propelling action is completed in 3 lifetimes. According to this perspective, the true propellers, ignorance and conditioning factors, occur in 1 life. The 3 accomplishers, craving and grasping and becoming, manifest in the 2nd existence, and the 5 propelled links, consciousness, name and form, sense powers, contact and feeling, together with the 2 accomplished links, birth and aging and death, occur in the 3rd life. Okay, let's see if this here clarifies anything. Don't do this now. These 3 lives need not be consecutive. In the course of every lifetime, actions are accumulated due to ignorance, and these give rise to subsequent existences. It is thus that ignorance marks the beginning of every cycle of 12 links. In other words, ignorance, conditioning factors occurring in some previous life, have propelled the 5 links of consciousness, name and form, sense powers, contact, and feeling now being experienced in the present existence, and which therefore form the middle part of the cycle. In the same way, the 3 accomplishers of a preceding life, craving, grasping, and becoming, themselves propelled by the actions of still earlier lives, have brought about what is accomplished in the present life, namely birth and aging and death. These last bring to an end a complete cycle of 12 links. This is how the wheel of life has rolled on from beginningless time. I would say this is not impossible to understand, but it's not something that I am versed in or adequately able to explain. But it is something that probably, if you focus on this, of course, it is possible to understand it. And it could possibly be interesting in terms of understanding our situation. Undoubtedly, it is interesting and relevant. But like I said, I'm going to simply just read on. At the shortest, 2 lives are required for an entire cycle of 12 links to unfold. The propellers, ignorance and conditioning factors, accumulate actions, aided and abetted by the accomplishers, craving and grasping. These will infallibly bring about a subsequent life, a process corresponding to the link of becoming. These links, together with consciousness in its causal aspect, make up 6 links that are played out in a single life. Because of them, birth into a subsequent existence takes place, and gradually the 4 links of name and form, sense powers, contact and feeling are perfected and are concluded by death. These are the 6 resultant links that are accomplished in another life. Now, even if a propelling karma has been accumulated, if at the moment of death it is not nourished by craving and grasping, no subsequent birth can occur. For there must be both propeller and accomplisher links occurring in the same life for a new existence to be produced. And since accomplished links manifest only within the environment of birth and death, it is clear that the propelled and accomplished links must also go together. However, the propeller links and the accomplisher links of the same 12-link cycle may in fact be separated by many lives. But it is impossible for this to happen in the case of the accomplisher links and the accomplished links. It might be thought that this contradicts the idea of a 12-link cycle taking 3 lives, but this is not true because the lives interposed between the propellers and the accomplishers of one cycle belong to other 12-link cycles. This then is the doctrine of dependent arising, expounding according to the theory that one propelling action engenders one existence. A single cycle must be complete in either 2 or 3 existences, there being no other alternative. Okay, so here there's a reference to a place in Khenpo Kunzang Palten's commentary on the way of the Bodhisattva. Quite simply, oh, wait a minute, sorry, this is different. Okay. Mipa Rinpoche explains, it is possible to conceive the cycle of 12 links unfolding within the time period required for the completion of a single action. In the case of killing, for instance, it is through ignorance that one becomes involved in the action. Conditioning factors are the action itself. Consciousness is the awareness of the moment of the action. Name and form and the 6 senses of that instant produce contact with a weapon, etc. Feeling is the experience of one's own satisfaction and the suffering of the other. Craving is represented by the willful engagement in the satisfaction and suffering just mentioned. This leads to grasping, i.e. an enthusiasm for similar events in the future. Becoming refers to the aggregates of the entire instant of the action. And this leads to the birth of the present and future aspects of the experience, which in turn passes through a period of transformation, aging, and the conclusion, death. Now this, I would say, this short note here by Jamgun Mipham, this actually, I think, gives quite a clear understanding of how these 12 links could take place within, when we say Jawi Kechi, or Jawi Tsopa Kechi, this means simply just one action. And that's where we can read into a single action and the experience associated with one action, these 12 links. So that's something I think that possibly is quite helpful. Okay. A successful examination of this doctrine will impart a deep understanding of the fact that the root of samsara is craving and grasping, and that with them, for they are true origins, suffering is always experienced. Indeed, if they are destroyed, no further birth will ensue, even though karma may still remain. This may be observed in the case of certain arhats. Okay, and that's where there's reference to hold on. There's a reference here to a place where Kunzang Palten, he explains something. It says here, the Shravakas, that's the same. The Shravakas contend that by simply overcoming afflictive emotions, one is liberated from all suffering. That's what we refer to here in terms of the craving and grasping. Yeah. This would mean that as soon as all negative emotions have been eradicated and arhatship attained, liberation from suffering should occur. For the Shravakas say that there is no more bondage. If this is indeed their position, it is apparently contradicted by the example of the noble arhats, the great Moggallana and Kubja the Small, who, though they were free from negative emotions, nevertheless suffered from the maturation of past karma. So there's a story of, yeah, so yes. So this refers to then how arhats indeed still experience the result of negative actions. Yeah. not entirely free. How to meditate on the principle of dependent arising. There are two ways of meditating on the 12 interdependent links, each involving a forward and a reverse direction. Okay, this what we're having now, that is not so difficult to understand. That is understanding that samsara originates from ignorance, and as such takes us all the way to this place. Now, that's how ignorance or samsara unfolds. In terms of reversing that cycle, we would simply say by ending ignorance, we also end conditioning factors, we end consciousness, name and form, the sense powers, etc., right? So this is where working with these 12 factors is essentially what we do on the path. And I would say that the explanation here obviously is excellent, but I would say just keep in mind that ignorance is what drives samsara, and when we reverse or liberate ourselves from samsara, we begin by ignorance, and putting an end to ignorance, everything else dries out, so to speak. Yeah. So if there's a flood, we turn off where the water stops, where the water comes from, it dries out. So Kangyur Rinpoche says there are two ways of meditating on the 12 interdependent links, each involving a forward and a reverse direction. It's called Luk Jung and Luk Dok in Tibetan. According to the first way, the forward order considers the process leading to birth in samsara, while the reverse order shows how this process is arrested. According to the second way, the forward direction describes both the production and the cessation of samsaric existence, starting from ignorance and working forward. The reverse order depicts the production and cessation of samsara also, but this time beginning with aging and death and working backward. So we can also, this is again referring to what I was mentioning before about the Pratyeka Buddha, that deduces where does death come from? It comes from birth, and that comes from becoming, etc. With regards to the first way, in the forward order, one considers that ignorance gives rise to conditioning factors gives rise to consciousness, and so forth. Or, and this amounts to the same thing, one can consider that birth gives rise to aging and death, becoming gives rise to birth, and so on. So that's where you can say, this came from that, and this came from that, and so forth. On the other hand, the reverse order entails the reflection that by halting ignorance, conditioning factors are halted, by halting conditioning factors, consciousness is halted, etc. Similarly, one can reflect that by halting birth, aging and death are halted, by halting becoming, birth is halted, and so forth. So it's essentially this chain reaction that we understand, or we're halting it, arresting it, interfering in it. By contrast, according to the second way, the forward order consists of meditating that due to ignorance, conditioning factors arise, and therefore by halting ignorance, conditioning factors are also halted. Due to conditioning factors, consciousness arises, and by arresting the conditioning factors, consciousness is also arrested. The reverse order, according to the second way, consists of thinking that aging and birth arise from aging and death arise from birth, and thus by halting birth, aging and death are also halted. Birth arises from becoming, and therefore by arresting becoming, birth is also arrested. This is not that difficult. The forward and reverse orders, according to the second method, may be used as a means to understanding the four truths, as expounded in Asanga's Abhidharma Samuchaya. If one applies the forward order leading to birth, one will arrive at an understanding of the truth of origin. So that's where we can see how birth comes about, coming back to the origin, which is then ignorance. So in the like manner, both the forward and reverse orders lead to the halting of birth, demonstrates the truth of the path and cessation. So we can understand then the cause, the suffering, and also the path in cessation. For example, the truth of origin is the defiled emotion, the root of which is ignorance. So when we have suffering, the truth of origin refers to the truth of suffering. Where does it come from? So that's where we say, well, it comes from the kleshas, and that comes from ignorance. So that's where we would say, due to ignorance, conditioning factors accumulate karma. Thus, the first link referring to the origin start with the two factors of karma and defiled emotions. This is what we looked at earlier. Establishing with the help of wisdom that ignorance gives rise to conditioning factors and conditioning factors to consciousness and so on, the truth of origin, defiled emotions, is grasped. On the other hand, the greatest of all suffering in samsara is aging and death, and this arises from birth. Applying thus the reverse order, the result of the afflictions, the truth of suffering is understood. Okay, so what we're basically talking about here are the Four Noble Truths and how they basically understanding causation. Then we understand the nature of suffering and also where it originates from in terms of both the conditions of kleshas and the conditions of karma, which then all come back again to ignorance. Now, the remedy, through the wisdom of realizing no self, which is the essence of the truth of the path. Everything we're doing on the path really goes back and essentially arrests this condition of ignorance, and that is the realization of no self. So through the wisdom of realizing no self, ignorance, the root of the truth of origin, is eradicated. By stopping ignorance, conditioning factors are stopped, and so on, up to old age and death. So again, this wisdom that we are cultivating throughout all of the path, and this is where I would like to say this, well, maybe you're not, there's sections in here that I'm a little bit very wobbly on with regards to, but at the end of the day, understanding causation and how ignorance creates the conditions that essentially drive our suffering, then through understanding the wisdom of no self, which is again everything what we're doing on the path, in one way or another, through either skillful means or direct realization of no self, it attacks or it arrests, puts an end to ignorance. So in this way, everything that is present within the cycle of samsara is brought to an end. Thus, the forward order leading gradually to the halting of birth reveals the truth of the path. And that's also where we can see, yes, this works in terms of the causes of suffering. And this is the source of liberation. Finally, the greatest sorrows of samsara from which we want to free ourselves are birth and death. And the halting of these is the truth of cessation. Thus, by stopping birth, aging and death are stopped, and so on, down to the halting of conditioning factors, whereby ignorance is halted. By reflecting on this way, the perfect result, namely the truth of cessation, is demonstrated. So the short here is, by realizing then the emptiness of self, then we essentially put an end to this cycle. A careful consideration of all this will reveal that the root of the overwhelming burden of samsaric suffering is ignorance, the belief in the true existence of a self. Conversely, one will understand that the wisdom realizing the truth of no self is the root of all true paths. Okay, this is the takeaway. So for all you could say, the intricacy of this discussion, this really is what this all boils down to, which is understanding really that the suffering that we experience, the root of it is ignorance. And the solution, what brings about an end to ignorance, is the wisdom that realizes this no self. So that's then, Kangyur Rinpoche then says, one must endeavor to gain conviction in this. This is really, if we can just understand that all of samsaric suffering comes from confusion, delusion or ignorance, avidya, this first one here. And it is understanding then and that it consists of the belief in a self, the belief in the true existence of a self, of the self, right? That's really what ignorance is, the belief in the true self. And as such, the wisdom that realizes the truth of no self is the root of all true paths. So that's where we understand the origin of suffering, and we understand the nature of the path that leads to cessation. So this is something that's reflected in all the various teachings that we practice, and all the theory that we engage in. So this is an important point. So Kangyur Rinpoche says one must endeavor to gain conviction in this. This conviction, however, can only be the result of profound reflection, extending far beyond beyond a casual or even close perusal of the teachings, of the entire treasure house of the profound and truthful utterances of the conqueror. The doctrine of dependent arising is the most crucial. Now, one really wonderful short sutra is what's called the rice seedling, and the Salistamba Sutra. And this actually we have in the 84,000. And that is where then there's a discussion really between Maitreya and I think it's Subhuti. And that's where Subhuti goes to Maitreya and says, this morning the Buddha was saying that right through understanding, he pointed to a rice plant and said, through understanding how a rice sprout comes about from a rice seed and then becomes a rice plant, and this you'll hear used plenty in the teachings, we can understand dependent arising. And through understanding dependent arising, we understand all of the Dharma. Whoever understands all of the Dharma understands the Buddha. And then he proceeds to then teach rather comprehensive, but also very manageable presentation of these 12 links of dependent arising. It's a really wonderful short sutra. So yeah, maybe I'll put for those of you who wish to do this, who wish to go into depth with this, this will be quite helpful to see what the footnote says. Indeed. So this is from Dilgu Kangyur Rinpoche, and he says, indeed, the entire range of teachings, from the vehicle of the Shravakas to those of the natural great perfection, have one meaning only, that of dependent arising. And at all times, the meaning remains the same, the only difference lying in the manner in which it is imparted and explained to beings. So this is where, if we want to understand the Buddhist teaching, then this is quite helpful. I don't in any way want to say something is more important than others, and of course it depends on the circumstances. But simply just understanding the gist of these few lines that we had earlier here, understanding how samsara originates with the belief in the true existence of the self, and how it's eliminated through the wisdom realizing no self, that sort of is a good place to begin. And then of course there are some further details. Okay, hold on, I probably read something a little bit, just a sec, just in terms of what we looked at, 45, 46. Oh, sorry, I was a little bit ahead of myself with the 45, 46. Okay, let's just look at the road. So, sorry. So this says here, the root of all dependent things is ignorance, whence comes conditioning factors, consciousness, name and form. From these six, the sense powers are born, whence contact, and from contact feeling. Thence come craving, and from craving grasping. Thence becoming, from becoming birth. With birth comes deprivation of one's wants, affliction, sickness, age, and death. A vast accumulation of pain is thus produced. When birth is halted, all these too are stopped. So the doctrine of dependent arising shows that ignorance is the root of samsara, while the wisdom of no self is the root of nirvana. There you have it. From ignorance comes conditioning factors, namely the three kinds of action, positive, negative, and unwavering, that propel beings into the samsaric state. From these come consciousness. Because of consciousness there is name and form, from which develop the six sense powers. These in turn bring about contact, the coincidence of object, sense organ, and consciousness, and when the eye perceives an object and so on. Because of contact, any of the three kinds of feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, are experienced. From these come craving, the desire to experience pleasure and be free from what is disagreeable. Craving produces grasping, and this gives rise to its result, becoming, i.e. the five aggregates. And because of becoming, the birth of the next life occurs. Once born, beings fail to get what they want and are tormented. Because of elemental imbalances, they fall ill, and all the time they get older and older, only to lose their lives in death. Thus, an immense mass of suffering is produced by arresting the continuous process of taking birth, experienced as a concrete reality in samsara. All suffering will be removed. So here we then have an overview of how these 12 cover all the various themes really in terms of understanding the sufferings of samsara. And then we have 47, which then reads, this teaching so profound, dependence of effects on causes, the very treasure of the truth the conqueror has taught. Yet true and supreme peace transcends the deeds that bring forth high and low existence, white and black phenomena in causal sequence. And when the unborn nature of phenomena is realized, it will manifest. So the profound principle of cause and effect, as manifested in the chain of dependent arising, is extremely difficult to fathom for those who are outside the Buddha Dharma. It is the most precious of the teachings of the Buddha, the speaker of truth. It is something to be profoundly treasured. This, of course, constitutes the knowledge around our existence. And while we have a lot of theories in various contexts as we sort of operate with in our worldview, then essentially this is what constitutes then an understanding of where does it all come from in the context of the Buddhist teaching. So this is something that's extremely important. So so next time we'll begin then, which is then understanding how, as much as there is phenomena that appear because they are dependent arising, they actually appear yet they have no reality. And that's where we talk about the unoriginated nature of dependent arising. A reflection that appears in the mirror is definitely a reflection, but there's nothing that has actually gone into the mirror, taken place, become real. There's an appearance, but nothing more. There's nothing that has originated. And when we walk away and the reflection is no longer there, there's nothing that has actually disappeared in terms of anything substantial. So that's why we talk about how all the dependently arisen appearances, they in fact have actually never attained any degree of reality. So this is also an important point. Okay. Okay, there's some questions here. Let's see. So one of my teachers stated that there are particular types of karma that can have the cause and effect in one lifetime. Are you able to elaborate on that? Oh yeah, that happens. I mean, apart from the sort of the general popular notion of instant karma, right? Where, you know, you have an argument and you walk out angry and immediately you sort of, your finger gets stuck in the door, yeah, that sort of thing. Then also the nature of cause and effect is such that it while we're explaining how various lifetimes, how karma plays out over various lifetimes, and how actions propel various lifetimes, then of course, like anything, really just depends on the particular conditions there, then a result can manifest at any given time. Why is conditioning factors coming before consciousness? You know, I'd have to look into that. And you know, very often when you have the skandhas, yes, then we of course have these factors. But as we saw later, then there's also in the context of becoming, that's where we identify skandhas of, you could say, taking place in terms of what then becomes the basis for the future rebirth. So, I think what we need to do here is say, this is interesting. We would say that ignorance then gives rise to conditioning factors, and then comes consciousness. We will have to basically take it from there where we're saying, I wonder why. Actually, anyway, personally, that's all I can do. And you could say that's food for thought, something that's worth pondering. And how is this consciousness different from Rigpa? Well, Rigpa is the very opposite of ignorance. So when there's Rigpa, there's no samsara. There's no, basically in the condition of Rigpa, all the 12 links have ceased. So that's where at that point then that instantly puts an end to the conditions of samsara. Of course, there's still appearances, but these appearances then arise, we would say, arise within the Dharmakaya. So that's where we understand Rigpa is a bit more than just mindfulness. It's then the complete absence of ignorance. How is not taking birth seen in Mahayana? I'd have to think about that also, but I would just immediately what comes to mind is that when we talk about birth here, we're talking about the unconsciousness that is basic to the entire cycle of rebirth. And certainly the Bodhisattva takes rebirth, but no longer out of unconsciousness, but out of compassion. So that's where the Bodhisattva, and we would say the enlightened ones, the sublime beings, they take birth, but no longer premised on ignorance and the 12 links. This was so great, and those charts elucidate the endless hell spiral perfectly. Okay, thank you. So a very illuminating session for me. Thank you. So if the ignorance is dependently arisen, what is the cause of the ignorance? Well, that you have in the Dzogchen prayer of Samantabhadra or Kunduzangpo, where we would essentially identify first what we call Dani Chikpo Mariplan. This is where the great perfection is quite helpful. We say there's this source ignorance, and from that then we have two kinds of ignorance, which are then the co-emergent ignorance and the labeling ignorance. And that's where, like we saw in the text, and if you look in the development of ego, the chapter I've uploaded in the resources, Chögyam Trungpa describes this very well, but we also have it in then this prayer that we often recite, you know, on solstice and other occasions. We would say, it says, from the basis of just unconsciousness, for a moment of just unconsciousness, then there arises the notion of basic confusion, and then there arises the notion of self and other. And from the self and other, then we have the various aspects of samsara. So essentially, according to the prayer of Kunduzangpo, then we would say that the cause of ignorance is this simply getting lost. And that's also what we looked at last time in terms of the dancer, that lost, having, like, I think, like Trungpa would say, enjoying ourselves too much. We got lost in the experience. A bodhisattva is striving to put an end to ignorance of self and other, yet takes birth. How can a Buddha takes birth if he transcends birth and rebirth? Well, essentially here, then we're talking about birth from two different perspectives. One is the birth that comes about due to ignorance, and the other is the birth that is the compassionate entry into samsara. And that's why we remember the bodhisattva vows to never retire to nirvana. And yet the bodhisattva is not caught in some, it's also not caught in some, so the Bodhisattva vows not to enter into nirvana, not leave sentient beings behind, and at the same time is not caught by samsara. So the Bodhisattva is not caught by these 12 links of dependent arising, yet enters purposely out of compassion. So virtuous actions also are based on ignorance, craving and grasping. But maybe the grasping is not as intense, so leads to more positive rebirth. Yeah, I mean, yes, we're definitely, when it comes to the notion of positive and negative karma, that all is explained here, and that has corresponding results. So the birth and the lifetimes that we experience, they can be of very different kinds. That's where we again talk about the higher and the lower realms. Yeah. Okay, so, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we'll conclude with dedication. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the Holy Gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the Holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So thank you. Oh yes, and happy Easter. Enjoy. Take care.